I took the night shift at the Smithsonian National Zoo in Washington, D.C. because I liked the quiet. After a decade of dealing with daytime crowds, screaming kids, and pushy parents, I wanted a break. Night duty was supposed to be uneventful, just walking the empty paths, checking the enclosures, making sure the animals weren't agitated. Most of them slept through the night, so I had plenty of time to sip my coffee and listen to the hum of the city just beyond the park. The only real work happened around 3 a.m. when I helped the skeleton crew handle feeding schedules for nocturnal animals. Other than that, I was alone. At least, I thought I was. It started about a week into the shift. I was doing my usual rounds near the Reptile Discovery Center when I noticed something off. The air smelled wrong. Not like the usual mix of animal musk and damp earth. It was something heavier, something cloying and sickly sweet, like rotting fruit left in the sun. At first, I assumed one of the keepers had left out spoiled meat for the Komodo dragons, but when I checked the feeding logs, everything was accounted for. Then I heard the sound. It wasn't an animal noise, not the growl of the big cats, not the hoots of the owls, not even the eerie chattering of the primates. This was something different. A deep, guttural clicking, like someone running a giant fingernail over stone. It was coming from beneath my feet. At first, I chalked it up to an overactive imagination. Maybe the pipes were acting up. Maybe it was the heating system kicking in. But that night, and the nights after, the clicking always came back, same spot, same time, just past 2 a.m. I asked a few of the other night crew if they'd heard anything. Most of them just shrugged. Could be raccoons in the vents, one of the maintenance guys said, but I saw the way his face tensed when he said it. Another worker, an old-timer named Keith, just muttered something about not messing with things that don't concern me. He wouldn't say anything else. That was my first real clue that something was wrong. One night, I brought my flashlight and waited by the source of the noise. The air was thick with that same sickly sweet stench. I crouched down near the storm drain, pressing my ear to the metal grate. The clicking was there, closer now, deliberate, like it knew I was listening. Then something scraped against the bars from below. Something big. I jumped back, heart pounding, as a low, wet exhale drifted up from the darkness. It smelled like blood and damp fur. My flashlight beam cut through the gaps in the grate, but all I saw was empty blackness, except for something slick and pulsing far below, shifting just out of sight. I reported it the next morning. The supervisor laughed it off. Probably just runoff pooling in the old access tunnels, she said. The zoo's been here since 1889, half the underground systems don't even show up on modern blueprints. That didn't make me feel any better. I couldn't let it go. I started digging through old records in my downtime, looking for anything about the tunnels. There wasn't much, just vague references to old maintenance routes, some notes on historical structures buried beneath the zoo. But then I found something buried in a dusty archive from the 1950s. It was a security report. 3 zookeepers had gone missing within 6 months. No bodies were ever found. The official explanation? Personnel left their positions without notice. But the last recorded location for 2 of them? Near the Reptile Discovery Center. The same place I heard the noises. I knew then that I had to go down there. I had to see what was waiting beneath the zoo. I had always assumed that the zoo's underground tunnels were nothing more than remnants of an older time, forgotten maintenance paths built decades ago to service enclosures before modern facilities made them obsolete. But after discovering the old security report detailing the disappearances of 3 zookeepers, all last seen near the Reptile Discovery Center, I began to suspect that the tunnels held something far more sinister. The official reports claimed these employees had abandoned their posts without notice, but something about that explanation felt deliberately incomplete. The zoo had operated for over a century, its history interwoven with expansions, renovations, and restructuring projects, but if these tunnels had truly been sealed off due to flooding in the 1980s, then why did I continue to hear strange noises emanating from below? More importantly, why did no one seem to want to talk about them? My curiosity soon turned into an obsession, and I knew that I would never be able to rest until I saw what was down there with my own eyes. I waited for the right moment, making sure I was alone during my shift before heading toward the service corridors near the primate house. Most workers avoided that section of the zoo at night, the air thick with the sour scent of animal musk, the distant echoes of nocturnal creatures stirring in their enclosures. I brought a crowbar and a heavy-duty flashlight, making my way past old storage rooms filled with unused equipment, my heart pounding as I reached the first access hatch. The metal door was bolted shut, rusted over with age, but the second door, hidden behind a stack of discarded cages, gave way with a long, painful groan, exhaling a gust of damp, stale air that carried the unmistakable scent of decay. The tunnel sloped downward, disappearing into absolute darkness, its walls lined with corroded pipes and electrical wiring coated in layers of dust and neglect. Water dripped somewhere in the distance, the sound echoing in a way that made the tunnel seem impossibly vast. And then I heard it again, the rhythmic clicking, deep and deliberate, like something enormous shifting just beneath the surface. I swallowed the rising nausea in my throat and stepped forward, my boots pressing into damp concrete as I shined my flashlight along the tunnel walls. The deeper I moved, the stronger the stench became, thick and organic, a mix of mildew, stagnant water, and something far worse. The passage branched in two directions, one path leading downward into an abyss my light couldn't penetrate, the other toward what appeared to be an abandoned storage area. I chose the storage area first, maneuvering through rusted shelving units and broken equipment, my eyes scanning faded warning signs that had long since lost their color. Danger, keep out. Authorized personnel only. Most of the supplies were useless, coiled hoses, shattered floodlights, old feeding crates, but at the very back of the room, partially buried beneath a pile of dust-covered papers, I found something that made my stomach twist into knots. It was a clipboard, its pages yellowed with age, detailing a feeding schedule from 1953. The handwriting was neat and clinical, listing weights and feeding times in carefully structured columns. But scrawled in the margins, in hurried, desperate script, were fragmented notes that sent a chill through my entire body. It's getting bigger. We need more. The last entry, underlined twice, read simply, "Don't go alone." I gripped the clipboard tighter, my pulse hammering against my skull, when a new sound reached my ears, a slow, wood-dragging noise, thick and unnatural, coming from just beyond the storage room's entrance. I froze, gripping my flashlight, my breath caught in my throat as the air shifted. The stench of rotting meat became overwhelming, the wet dragging sound punctuated by sharp, deliberate clicks, like claws scraping against stone. I turned the flashlight toward the tunnel just in time to see something enormous shifting at the very edge of the darkness, its slick, unnatural form pressing against the tunnel walls before retreating just out of sight. The instinct to run overpowered everything else. I turned on my heel, my boots splashing through the puddles as I sprinted toward the exit, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I struggled to navigate the uneven terrain. The sound behind me grew louder, faster, the clicking accelerating, the wet dragging intensifying as whatever was lurking in the depths followed in pursuit. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. I reached the maintenance door, throwing my entire weight against it as I shoved it open and stumbled into the service corridor, gasping for air. The flashlight trembled in my grip as I turned it back toward the tunnel, its beam illuminating nothing but stillness, the darkness beyond the threshold impenetrable and silent. But I knew something was there, watching from the shadows, waiting just beyond the reach of the light. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, standing there for what felt like an eternity, my ears straining for any sign of movement on the other side. The silence that followed was almost worse than the noise. My mind raced with possibilities, trying to piece together what I had just seen, what I had barely escaped from. There was no question anymore, something was living down there, something enormous, something the zoo had tried to forget. And now I knew that I had found it. I didn't sleep that morning when my shift ended. I sat in my car in the employee parking lot, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, staring at the looming structure of the zoo, knowing that somewhere beneath those exhibits, beneath the paths where families walked and children laughed, something hungry was waiting. I considered telling someone, filing a report, bringing it to the attention of the administration, but deep down I knew that someone already knew. The feeding logs. The missing employees. The way the night staff avoided talking about the tunnels. No, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't just some neglected underground system. Someone had been feeding it. And I had just woken it up. I barely made it through my next shift without losing my composure. Every sound, every rustling leaf, every distant growl of an animal in its enclosure set my nerves on edge. I kept my routine as normal as possible, following my patrol routes, checking the exhibits, responding to minor alerts from the security system, but my mind was fixated on the tunnels beneath the zoo. The sounds, the smell, the thing that had moved just outside my flashlight's reach. It was down there, awake, aware. And worst of all, I had no idea if it had always been watching us or if my intrusion had changed something. The staff acted normal, going about their business, oblivious to the thing lurking beneath them. But now that I knew what to look for, I noticed the subtle signs of unease, how some of the night workers avoided the service corridors, how Keith, the old-timer, never took his rounds near the Reptile Discovery Center. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was avoidance, the kind that only came with long-standing, unspoken knowledge. Something no one wanted to admit out loud. I considered pressing him, asking outright what he knew, but I had a feeling it would be useless. People don't talk about things like this. Things that aren't supposed to exist. That night, I returned to the spot near the old service tunnel, not because I wanted to, but because some instinct inside me, some gnawing, undeniable force, demanded that I confirm it was real. My mind kept trying to explain it away. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe the old feeding logs were a hoax, a leftover prank from a forgotten time. Maybe the missing zookeepers had simply left, disappeared into ordinary lives somewhere else. But as I stepped closer to the sealed entrance, as the sickly sweet rot filled my nostrils, as the air itself seemed to pulse with something thick and unseen, I knew. The tunnel was still there, the heavy rusted door locked in place, but the feeling was different now. It was more than the smell, more than the damp heat rising from the ground. It was the weight of the air. I had felt it once before, in the woods as a kid, when I had wandered too close to something's den and it had watched me without making a sound. A presence, unseen but undeniably there. I moved my flashlight over the old security panels, trying to find some kind of locking mechanism. The zoo had officially sealed the tunnels off decades ago, but a place like this always had access points, emergency entrances, maintenance hatches. I had found one before, but I wasn't foolish enough to go back inside alone. Not yet. Instead, I checked the concrete flooring, brushing aside layers of dust and grime, and that was when I saw it, the footprints. They weren't human. They weren't any animal I had ever seen. For distinct impressions, long and narrow, almost reptilian, but wrong. The proportions weren't right. The spacing suggested something that had moved on two legs, but the back impressions dragged slightly, as if whatever had made them wasn't fully lifting its weight with each step. My stomach clenched as I traced the path with my eyes. They led up from the tunnel entrance. And then they stopped. Not as if they had turned around. Not as if they had been washed away. As if whatever had made them had vanished mid-stride. I staggered back, my breath catching in my throat. My pulse pounded against my ribs, my muscles screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that spot as possible. But I forced myself to stay just a little longer, listening, feeling, waiting for something, anything, to betray its presence. The zoo was silent. Too silent. The usual night sounds, wind through the trees, the distant chatter of the nocturnal animals, were gone. The air was thick with something I couldn't name. And then, just as I turned to leave, I heard it. Not from the tunnel. Not from below. From the trees above me. A slow, deliberate clicking, deep and rhythmic, shifting from one spot to another, as if something was watching me from the canopy. My flashlight beam swept through the branches, illuminating the tangled maze of leaves and limbs. Nothing. Just shifting shadows and movement that could have been the wind. But I knew better. I could feel it, perched somewhere in the darkness, waiting. I forced myself to walk, not run, back toward the main paths. My instinct screamed at me to bolt, but I knew that whatever was out there, running would only provoke it. I gripped my flashlight tight, keeping the beam steady, my breath slow and even. The clicking didn't stop. It followed, stalking from tree to tree, mirroring my movements. I stepped into the artificial light of the main walkway, where the security lamps cast long yellow pools over the pavement. The clicking hesitated. Then it stopped. I didn't dare look back. I kept moving, making my way toward the staff buildings, forcing myself to act like everything was normal, like nothing had just followed me from the depths of that abandoned tunnel. I made it to the break room, my hands shaking as I poured myself a cup of coffee. Keith was there, watching me from across the table, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then, finally, he sighed, rubbing his temple like a man who had been waiting for this conversation for a long time. "You went down there, didn't you?" I set my coffee down, my fingers still trembling. "You knew." Keith exhaled, staring at something distant, something not in the room. "We don't talk about it. We don't go down there. We leave it alone." I felt anger rise in my chest. Then why do we still work here? Why does the zoo pretend it doesn't exist? He looked at me then, his eyes tired. Because something still needs to be fed. I stared at him, my stomach twisting, my mind rejecting the implications of what he had just said. But before I could press him for more, before I could demand the truth, the overhead security system chimed, a motion alert, triggered from the south end of the zoo. The Reptile Discovery Center. I met Keith's gaze, and for the first time, I saw something in his expression that made my blood run cold. It wasn't just fear. It was resignation. The alert chimed again. Something had left the tunnels. And now it was inside the zoo. The motion alert chimed again, its tone too soft for the sheer weight of what it implied. My hands were still locked around the cup of coffee, but I had lost all feeling in my fingers. I barely heard Keith as he muttered something under his breath, something that sounded suspiciously like a prayer. I forced myself to move, setting the cup down without breaking eye contact with him. "What do you mean it still needs to be fed?" My voice came up too steady, too calm for the way my heart pounded in my chest. Keith exhaled heavily, rubbing his face with one weathered hand, his fingers trembling just slightly. "I mean exactly what it sounds like." He didn't look at me when he spoke, his eyes fixed on something I couldn't see, something past the walls of this break room, something he had carried with him for far too long. The zoo has agreements. Or at least it used to. Before people stopped asking questions. The motion alert chimed again. We both turned toward the small security monitor in the corner of the break room. The grainy, black and white feed from the Reptile Discovery Center flickered on the screen. At first, I thought the camera was glitching. The image wavered, the shadows stretching unnaturally, twisting in ways that didn't make sense. And then, for a brief moment, I saw it. Something big. Too big for the corridor it was moving through. The motion sensors weren't just picking up movement. They were picking up something breaking through the sealed tunnels. Keith stood up so fast his chair scraped against the tile. "We need to shut down the south quadrant. Now." I was already moving. My mind was screaming at me to run in the opposite direction, to leave, to pretend none of this was real, but my body acted on instinct. I followed Keith through the staff halls, past the locked storage rooms and into the security hub, where the larger monitors displayed every camera feed across the zoo. My stomach dropped when I saw the map overlay. The thing was moving fast. The alert system showed triggered sensors and a direct path leading away from the Reptile Discovery Center toward the central enclosures. Toward the animals. Keith swore under his breath, his fingers flying across the control panel. I saw him override the automatic systems, forcing lockdown protocols in real time. A section of the zoo flickered red on the screen. "That should slow it down," he muttered. "Buy us some time." The words barely left his mouth before a new alert chimed. Sector 7. The Big Cats Exhibit. We both turned toward the camera feeds, the grainy night vision flickering as the system tried to keep up with the motion sensors. The lions were still asleep, sprawled lazily across the artificial rock formations, their massive bodies rising and falling with each breath. They were completely unaware of what was coming. And then, movement. Not from the lions. From the trees behind the enclosure. A shadow broke away from the darkness, something impossibly large, something that shouldn't exist above ground. My mouth went dry as the image sharpened for a fraction of a second, just long enough to process what I was seeing. It wasn't an animal. At least, not in any way that made sense. Its body was slick, wet, like the skin of something that had never known sunlight. Its limbs were too long, its posture hunched and unnatural, its silhouette shifting like it was adjusting to the open air. But the worst part, the thing that sent a cold, primal terror curling around my ribs, was the way it moved. Not like a predator. Not like something stalking prey. Like something curious. It pressed itself low against the perimeter fence, its head, if you could call it that, tilting slightly, observing. Studying. It knew the lions were there. It knew we were watching. The cameras flickered. A distortion rippled across the feed, and for half a second, the screen filled with nothing but static. When the image returned, the thing was gone. The lions were awake now, their bodies tensed, ears flicking toward the perimeter, muscles coiled with the uncertainty of something they could sense but couldn't see. One of them, a massive male with a scar down its flank, let out a low, uneasy growl. Another chimed in, their deep voices rumbling through the night. Keith slammed a button on the control panel. We need to lock down the enclosures. All of them. I didn't argue. The alarms blared a second later, sending an automated emergency lockdown protocol throughout the zoo. Every exhibit, every security door, every access point sealed itself shut. The lions were now trapped inside their enclosure, as safe as they could be under the circumstances. But it didn't feel like enough. Not when something was already inside. We stared at the monitors, waiting, listening, watching for movement. For long, suffocating minutes, the zoo remained eerily still. The security alert stopped. The motion sensors went quiet. And then, a scraping sound. Not over the speakers. Not from the cameras. From the roof of the security office. Keith and I didn't move. The sound was slow, deliberate, claws dragging against metal. It came in patterns, long, careful scrapes, like something thinking, like something trying to figure out what was inside. My entire body screamed at me to stay still. And then, silence. The weight of it pressed down on me harder than the sound itself. The air in the security office grew thick, charged with something unseen. I could hear Keith breathing next to me, slow and controlled, but I knew he felt it too. A presence. A waiting. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to look. And then the lights went out. The monitors died. The emergency backup should have kicked in immediately, but nothing happened. Just darkness. And in that darkness, a click. Not mechanical. Not from the system. A deep, deliberate clicking noise coming from inside the room. I felt the cold wave of realization crash over me. It wasn't outside anymore. It was in here with us. The air inside the security office turned thick, suffocating, charged with an unnatural weight that pressed against my skull. I couldn't see anything beyond the absolute blackness that swallowed the room, but I could hear it. The clicking, slow, deliberate, like the sound of joints popping in something too large, too wrong. It was near the far wall at first, near the monitors that had gone dark, but then it shifted. The sound crept closer. Keith didn't move, and I didn't dare breathe. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, to break for the door, but I knew that whatever was in this room was waiting for that. It had followed us here, studied us, toyed with us like a predator cornering its prey. I gripped the edge of the desk in front of me, my nails pressing so hard against the wood that I thought they'd splinter, my muscles frozen in a terrible, shaking stillness. Another click, closer this time, right against the floor near the opposite side of the desk. A slow, heavy inhalation, wet and too deep, like lungs that had never breathed air before were learning how. A shifting sound followed, something dragging over linoleum. I felt Keith's presence next to me, the weight of his silence screaming louder than any words ever could. He knew exactly what this was. Then the lights flickered, not back on, not fully, but something surged through the power grid, sending a brief, sickly green glow pulsing through the room, casting everything in a nightmarish, slow-motion strobe. For less than a second, the shadows took form, and I saw it. It wasn't just big. It was impossible. Its body was slick, glossy, reflecting the faint green light in an almost gelatinous sheen. It was hunched, its elongated limbs bending in ways that made my stomach turn. And its head, God, its head, was stretched, too long for its body, with no eyes, no discernible features, just a smooth, pulsing surface that seemed to shudder as it clicked again. The sound wasn't from its mouth, it had no mouth. It was coming from inside its body. The lights cut out again, and in that instant, I felt its movement. It had shifted in that moment of darkness. Not toward the door. Not toward Keith. Toward me. My breath hitched, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. The silence was unbearable. It knew we could see it now. It knew we understood. Then Keith moved. It happened in a blur. He grabbed the heavy flashlight from the desk and threw it across the room, the metal clattering hard against the opposite wall. The thing reacted instantly. The clicking turned sharp, erratic, and the moment it lunged, Keith grabbed my arm and dragged me toward the door. I hit the hallway first, stumbling, gasping, the air suddenly cold against my sweat-soaked skin. Behind me, I heard Keith slam the door shut and twist the lock. But even as the latch clicked into place, something slammed against the other side. Hard. The walls shook. The doorframe groaned. We ran. The hallway stretched long before us, the emergency lights flickering dimly, throwing our elongated shadows against the walls. The security office was at the edge of the administrative buildings, close to the back service roads, but the thing had gotten in. It had bypassed the locked doors, the motion sensors, the security systems. It had come straight for us. Keith was ahead of me, his movements too practiced, too sure. He had done this before. I couldn't stop myself from gasping between breaths. You knew. My voice came out strangled, broken. You knew this was real. Keith didn't look back. I told you, we don't go down there. We don't wake it up. Something screeched behind us, a sound I had never heard before, not from any living thing. It was deep, grinding, layered, as if multiple voices were trying to crawl out of one throat. The impact against the door repeated, once, twice, then a crack as it splintered. We reached the emergency exit. Keith shoved it open, and suddenly, the humid night air rushed around me, cool against my burning skin. We spilled out into the back-loading dock, just beyond the administrative buildings, where the employee service road looped behind the exhibits. Keith doubled over, hands on his knees, breathing hard. I wasn't much better, my legs were shaking, my lungs burning. But before I could regain my breath, I heard the sound again. Not from the door this time. From the roof. I looked up just in time to see something enormous moving along the rooftop, its slick, elongated form sliding over the edge of the building, its limbs crawling downward with sickening ease. It wasn't falling, it was adjusting, its body twisting unnaturally, finding new ways to move. Keith grabbed my arm again, his grip iron tight. Truck. Now. We bolted across the loading dock, my mind spinning, my body acting on pure adrenaline. The staff vehicles were parked just beyond the gate, a row of white zoo trucks and golf carts lined up against the perimeter fence. Keith's keys were already in his hands, shaking as he fumbled to find the right one. Something hit the ground behind us. A wet, organic thud. I turned, my stomach lurching, as the thing straightened itself, its limbs shifting, extending, its grotesque, featureless head tilting toward us. The clicking returned, deep, curious, almost amused. The truck door flew open, and Keith shoved me inside, slamming it behind him. The engine roared to life, the headlights cutting through the dark just in time for me to see it lunge forward, closing the distance between us with terrifying speed. Keith didn't hesitate. He floored it. The tires screeched as we peeled out of the lot, gravel spitting up behind us. I twisted in my seat, watching the thing recoil from the sudden light, its body shifting backward, blending into the shadows, its form slipping back toward the enclosures like it belonged there. Like it had been here all along. Neither of us spoke as we tore down the back roads, past the darkened exhibits, past the empty visitor walkways, past the places that had once felt safe. My hands were shaking so badly I had to press them into my knees to stop from completely falling apart. Keith's knuckles were white against the steering wheel. His face was pale, his expression grim. And then, barely above a whisper, he muttered, "It knows we saw it." My throat went dry. He didn't look at me, just kept driving. And it doesn't like that. Keith drove in silence, his grip on the wheel iron tight, knuckles pale beneath the glow of the dashboard lights. The truck's tires hummed against the empty road, the zoo receding behind us like a bad dream refusing to fade. But I knew better. This wasn't a dream, wasn't something I could leave behind by simply driving away. It was still there. It was always there. The sickly sweet rot still clung to the back of my throat, the clicking sound still echoed somewhere in the depths of my skull. I stared out the window at the darkened service roads, past the locked gates, past the looming silhouettes of enclosures that now felt like graves. Keith's words from earlier rattled in my head, the weight of them settling deep in my bones. It still needs to be fed. The moment I had found those feeding logs, I had known, deep down, I had known. But hearing it said out loud, with all the finality of someone who had accepted it long ago, turned my stomach inside out. I couldn't take the silence anymore. How long has this been going on? My voice was hoarse, raw, barely more than a whisper. Keith didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the road, jaw clenched so tight I thought he might break his teeth. Finally, he exhaled through his nose, a long, controlled breath. Longer than you or me. Longer than any of us. I shook my head. That's not an answer. He gave a humorless laugh. It's the only one you're gonna get. I wasn't letting it go. The logs I found were from the 50s. The missing zookeepers. Were not the first, Keith cut in, voice flat. And they weren't the last. My stomach twisted. Jesus Christ. Keith finally glanced at me, his expression unreadable. You think this place runs on ticket sales and government funding? The realization hit me like a brick to the chest. The zoo was too big, too well-maintained, too perfect despite decades of financial struggles, changes in leadership, and declining attendance. A million little blessings. Because something else was paying the cost. My hands curled into fists against my lap. Who else knows? Keith exhaled, shaking his head. Not many. They keep it that way on purpose. People come and go in this job, but a few of us? We stick around. We figure it out. And we do what we have to do. I turned to him fully now, anger burning through the fear. What the hell does that mean? Keith tightened his grip on the wheel. It means some of us make sure it doesn't go hungry. The words sat between us like a live wire, sparking, burning, threatening to set everything alight. The truck hit a rough patch of road, jostling me hard against the seat, but I barely noticed. My pulse pounded in my ears, a sickening realization creeping up my spine like ice water. It's not just animals, is it? Keith didn't answer. He didn't need to. I turned away, staring out at the darkened trees flashing past the window, bile rising in my throat. Who? My voice was barely audible over the hum of the tires. Keith swallowed. No one that'll be missed. A cold, crawling horror settled in my bones. We weren't just feeding it. We were offering sacrifices. I felt sick. I wanted to be anywhere but here, trapped in this truck with a man who had just admitted, without hesitation, without regret, that this wasn't just some dark secret buried beneath the zoo. It was an agreement, upheld and maintained like any other business deal. A cost paid in flesh and blood. I turned back to him, my voice sharp with disbelief. And you're okay with that? Keith didn't look at me. His jaw was set, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. I do what needs to be done. I laughed, bitter and humorless. So that's it? That's the job? Keith's fingers flexed against the wheel. It's not a job. It's a responsibility. I wanted to hit him. I wanted to scream, to grab him by the collar and shake him until something in his expression cracked, until I saw something, anything, that resembled guilt. But he sat there, solid and unflinching, a man who had long since accepted what had to be done. and that terrified me more than anything. I pressed a shaking hand to my forehead, trying to force my thoughts into something coherent. How do you even pick them? Keith was silent for a long moment. Then, finally, he muttered, "The city's full of people no one looks for." I clenched my teeth. "You mean homeless people?" Keith exhaled heavily. "Runaways. Drifters. People that fall through the cracks. People no one asks about." My skin crawled. "And you take them?" He shook his head. "Not me." He finally turned to look at me again, his expression unreadable. "I'm not the one that makes the calls." I was shaking now, my body barely containing the rage curling beneath my ribs. "So what, the higher-ups at the zoo just hand people over? They've been doing this for decades?" Keith was quiet for a long time. Then, in a voice so low I almost didn't hear it, he said, "Longer." I didn't want to ask what that meant. I already knew. This thing, whatever it was older than the zoo itself. The zoo wasn't built over the tunnels. The tunnels were built around it. The zoo wasn't just an attraction. It was a cover. A cage for something that couldn't be contained any other way. A cage that was breaking. I swallowed hard, trying to slow my racing pulse. "You said something earlier." My voice felt distant, detached. "You said it doesn't like that we saw it." Keith gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Does that mean it's coming for us?" Keith didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the road, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the wheel just a little too tight. "It means the rules have changed." I exhaled sharply, my mind spinning. The thing had been contained for decades, long enough for entire generations of zookeepers to understand the agreement, to maintain it, to keep it hidden. But now it was loose. Now it had seen us. And that meant we weren't just keepers anymore. We were prey. I pressed my fingers against my temples, trying to think. "So what do we do?" Keith was silent for so long I thought he wasn't going to answer. But then, in a voice so low I barely caught it, he said, "We feed it." I turned to him, horror crashing over me like a tidal wave. "Not a chance in hell." Keith finally looked at me then, his expression grim, resigned. "It's not about what we want." I stared at him, my breath coming too fast, too shallow. The truck rattled down the service road, the zoo shrinking in the rearview mirror, but I knew this wasn't over. The rules had changed. And now, something had to die. The truck moved steadily along the darkened roads, the soft hum of the tires the only sound between us. The city glowed faintly beyond the trees, a reminder that normalcy still existed somewhere out there, but inside this cab, nothing was normal anymore. The zoo sat behind us like a bad dream refusing to fade, and I could feel it lingering in the back of my mind, like something unfinished, something waiting. Keith's words sat like a dead weight in my chest. "We feed it." The simplicity of the statement was the worst part. No hesitation, no doubt, just a cold, absolute truth. I wanted to believe there was another way, a different solution, but the silence between us told me everything I needed to know. Keith had already played his part in this before, and he knew how this ended. I forced my voice to come out steady. "And if we don't?" Keith exhaled through his nose, his fingers drumming against the wheel, his movements too controlled, too measured. "Then it takes what it wants." I swallowed hard, my mind racing through every possibility, every potential way out, but I came up empty. There was no plan for something like this, no emergency protocol, no one to call for help. The police? They'd laugh me off the phone. The media? No one would believe a word of it. And if I started making too much noise, if I tried to tell the world what was hiding beneath the zoo, I knew exactly how that would end. Either they'd get to me first, or it would. The thing that had broken free of the tunnels, the thing that had been kept hidden for generations, it was smart, and it had seen us. I stared out at the darkened city streets flashing past. How do we know it's not following us? Keith's jaw tightened. We don't. I turned to him, my stomach twisting. You're telling me it could be anywhere right now? Keith didn't answer immediately, but when he finally spoke, his voice was flat. It's patient. It's been here longer than any of us. And for the first time in decades, it's not where it's supposed to be. My pulse pounded in my ears. And you still think feeding it is going to fix that? Keith turned down a quieter road, avoiding the main streets, moving deeper into the forgotten corners of the city. I could see the tension in his grip, the way his hands curled a little too tightly around the wheel, the way his shoulders held a weight that wasn't just exhaustion. He wasn't sure anymore. The system, the agreement, whatever the hell you wanted to call it, had worked for decades, but the moment we stepped into those tunnels, the balance had shifted. We're not its keepers anymore, are we? I whispered. Keith inhaled sharply but didn't answer. That told me everything I needed to know. We drove in silence for what felt like forever. The streets were eerily empty, the city asleep, and yet I felt watched, as if something still trailed us in the darkness, waiting for the right moment. The weight of it all pressed against me, suffocating. There had to be another way. I wouldn't accept that the only way to fix this was to find someone, some poor soul, and throw them into the jaws of something waiting in the dark. And then Keith slowed the truck. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. A man stood at the edge of an alleyway, wrapped in layers of tattered clothing, his thin frame shrouded in the sickly yellow glow of a flickering street lamp. His eyes were dark, hollow, scanning the street like a stray dog searching for food. A homeless man. A target. Keith's hands were steady on the wheel, but his breathing had changed, slower, measured, like he was convincing himself this was the right thing to do. No, I said immediately. Keith didn't move. I gritted my teeth. We're not doing this. He finally looked at me. We don't have a choice. I grabbed his arm, my fingers digging into the rough fabric of his jacket. Yes, we do. Keith exhaled sharply, turning back to the road, his expression unreadable. The truck idled, the man in the alley still oblivious to our presence. I could feel the moment of hesitation, the shift in Keith's resolve. Maybe it was because I was there. Maybe it was because, deep down, he wanted a way out just as much as I did. Then what do you suggest? He asked quietly. I didn't have an answer. Because there wasn't one. Because the truth, the awful, horrifying truth, was that Keith was right. If we didn't give it what it wanted, if we didn't play by the rules that had been established long before us, then we wouldn't be the ones making the decision. It would. And it wouldn't be choosy. Keith pulled the truck away from the curb, his hands gripping the wheel like a vice. We drove in silence, neither of us able to look at the other. The decision had been made. But not by us. By it. The next time I saw movement, I nearly screamed. My nerves were so shot, my body so tense, that the simple flicker of a shadow sent a bolt of panic straight through my spine. But this time, it wasn't it. It was a cop. A patrol car sat at the intersection, idling beneath a red light. 2 officers inside. Just another routine night shift for them. Just another night in a city where monsters weren't supposed to exist. And that's when the idea hit me. I turned to Keith, my breath shaky but determined. What if we don't have to choose? Keith frowned. What? I gestured toward the cop car. We don't choose who gets taken. We let it happen. Keith shook his head. That's not how this works. Why not? My voice was rising now, desperate, frantic. If this thing is loose, if it's hunting, then someone is going to die tonight. That's inevitable, right? Keith didn't answer. I pressed forward. So why does it have to be us making the call? Why do we have to be the executioners? Keith's jaw clenched. Because that's the way it's always been done. Then maybe it's time for that to change. I could feel it, the shift. Keith wasn't a monster. He was a man who had spent years convincing himself that this was the only way. That his hands weren't dirty because the system had already been in place long before he came along. But now, the system was broken. And that meant there were no rules anymore. I turned back to the cop car, my heart hammering. "We wait," I whispered. "We wait and we watch." Keith didn't move, but he didn't argue either. We sat there in silence, watching, waiting. And then, just as the light turned green, the power went out. The entire block, dark. A surge of dread shot through me, my breath catching in my throat. Then the streetlights flickered back on, and the cop car was empty. The doors were still closed. The engine was still running. But the officers? Gone. Keith inhaled sharply, his face pale. Jesus Christ. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. Because I knew what had just happened. We didn't make the choice. It did. And now it was full. For now. I turned to Keith, my voice barely a whisper. "This isn't over, is it?" Keith shook his head slowly, staring at the empty car. "No," he murmured. "Not even close." The city lights flickered as we sat in stunned silence, the empty patrol car illuminated in the sickly glow of the street lamps. The officers were gone, not a trace of movement inside the vehicle, no shattered windows, no sign of a struggle, just an engine humming idly as if its occupants had simply vanished from existence. My breath came shallow and quick, the weight of the moment pressing against my chest like a vice. It had taken them. It had made its choice. Keith didn't speak, his fingers tightening on the wheel, his expression blank in the worst way possible, not shock, not horror, but acceptance. I couldn't take it. I turned to him, my voice shaking. "That's it, then? We just pretend this never happened? Move on like everything's normal?" Keith exhaled, running a hand over his face, and I could see the cracks forming, the wear of too many years of carrying a truth that no one should have to bear. "That's the way it works," he muttered. "That's how it's always worked." I wanted to hit him. I wanted to scream. But I knew it wasn't his fault, not really. He had been indoctrinated into this, we both had, and I was just as much a part of it now as he was. Whether I wanted to be or not. The zoo loomed in my mind like a ghost, its enclosures, its pathways, its tunnels. It wasn't a place of conservation, of education, of preservation. It was a containment zone, a carefully maintained offering ground for something that should never have existed in the first place. And for decades, it had worked. The system had remained stable. The cost had been paid in quiet disappearances, in erased names, in people who slipped through the cracks of society without notice. But now the system was broken. Now it had decided to choose for itself. And that changed everything. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to remain steady. "So what happens now?" Keith started the truck again, pulling us away from the scene, merging onto the quiet streets leading back toward the zoo. The fact that we were going back, it all made my stomach twist, but where else could we go? This wasn't the kind of thing you left behind. "We fix it," Keith said simply. A humorless laugh broke from my throat. "Fix it? Like hell we do. This thing isn't following the rules anymore." Keith's jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the road. "That's why we have to reestablish control. If it doesn't go back underground, if we don't put it back where it belongs, we lose everything." I shook my head. "You still think it belongs anywhere? It's not an animal, Keith. It's not something you can put behind glass and call it contained. It's been playing along because it's wanted to. Now it doesn't." Keith exhaled sharply through his nose, gripping the wheel until the leather creaked beneath his fingers. "Then we give it a reason to go back." A chill ran down my spine. "And what does that mean?" Keith's expression didn't change, but his silence spoke volumes. I knew what it meant. The zoo would have to make a larger offering, something bigger than a handful of forgotten souls. Something that would remind it why it stayed in the dark, why it let the rest of the world exist untouched. It meant we were going to be a part of it now. I turned away, my stomach roiling. I didn't want to be in this truck anymore. I didn't want to be anywhere near Keith, near the zoo, near anything that meant I had to be a part of whatever happened next. But there was no way out. The moment I stepped foot into those tunnels, the moment I saw it, my fate had been sealed. I wasn't a keeper anymore. I wasn't a bystander. I was part of the system. The truck pulled through the employee entrance of the zoo, past the darkened exhibits, past the silent pathways that just hours ago had been bustling with families, children, laughter. They had no idea what existed just beneath their feet. Keith parked near the security office, but neither of us moved. The weight of it all sat between us like a storm waiting to break. I stared ahead, my voice hollow. If I walk away now, do I make it out of this? Keith didn't look at me. No. A lump formed in my throat. So that's it. He nodded. That's it. The silence stretched. I closed my eyes, trying to breathe, trying to focus on something, anything other than the reality settling around me like a cage locking shut. Then Keith spoke, softer this time. You don't have to be involved. Not like I am. Not yet. I forced myself to look at him. Then what the hell do I do? Keith met my eyes, something like regret flickering behind his own. You stay quiet. You go back to work. You act like nothing happened. A bitter laugh escaped me. And when it does happen again? Keith looked away. Then you make a choice. I clenched my fists, every muscle in my body screaming at me to fight this, to run, to do anything other than sit here and accept the fact that this was my life now. But the truth settled deep in my bones, cold and unshakable. There was no escape. If I left, I would be hunted. Not by the zoo. Not by the people keeping the secret. By it. I exhaled shakily, finally reaching for the door handle. My hand hovered over it for a moment, as if opening it would make this all real, but then I forced myself to push it open and step out. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and distant animal musk. Keith climbed out beside me, locking the truck behind him, and for the first time since the night began, I felt something close to defeat. I followed him back inside, through the quiet hallways of the security wing, past the empty break room, past the monitors that showed nothing unusual. Everything looked normal. And that was the worst part of all. Because I knew now that normal was a lie. The world didn't make room for things like this, for things that existed outside the laws of nature. But they were there, lurking in the forgotten spaces, waiting in the dark, feeding off the ones who disappeared without a trace. The zoo had simply built itself around one, made it a secret, made it a deal, made it a system that no one questioned because no one knew. But I knew now. And there was no walking away from that. Keith stopped at the door to his office, hesitating for just a moment before finally turning back to me. You should get some rest. Tomorrow, we act like nothing happened. I nodded, though I didn't know if I meant it. Keith disappeared into his office. I stood there for a long time, staring at the blank monitors, at the empty pathways leading into the zoo, at the shadows between the exhibits that felt too deep now, too watchful. Somewhere below us, it was waiting. And I had the sickening feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. Because now it knew my name.